July 20th, 1969. 600 million people watched as a human being prepared to set foot on the moon. It was the single greatest achievement in the history of science. The man behind the rocket that made it possible was Wernher von Braun. America celebrated him. Time magazine put him on its cover, and he became the public face of NASA's ambition and success. But long before the Apollo program, von Braun spent his career developing a different kind of rocket. He built the V-2 ballistic missile, a weapon used by the Third Reich to rain destruction on London and Antwerp. This rocket was assembled in a factory carved into a mountain, an underground facility called Middlework, where men worked in tunnels without sunlight or mercy. Those workers were concentration camp prisoners. They were worked to death in the cold and the dark, building a weapon for a regime that considered them racially inferior. More people died building von Braun's rocket than were ever killed by it. Yet this SS officer was allowed to trade his uniform for an American suit and transform into a national hero. In the final months of World War II, American intelligence teams trailed behind combat troops to scour occupied Germany for military and scientific research before it could be destroyed. Fished out of a university toilet at Bonn, they found the Osenberg list. It was a catalog of the scientists and engineers who had spent years working for the Third Reich. President Harry Truman officially sanctioned a program to recruit these men, but with a strict condition. He forbade the agency from recruiting any Nazi members or active supporters. Officials within the JIOA and OSS viewed this order as a hindrance and quietly bypassed the directive. They opened the files and started editing. By whitewashing records of war crimes, they turned party members into acceptable immigrants. These agencies made a calculated choice to bypass the president's order, deciding that the intelligence these men possessed was more valuable than the accountability demanded by their pasts. This was a systematic migration. Over 1,600 German scientists and technicians were secretly moved to military bases and laboratories across the United States. The government valued this intellectual transfer at $10 billion. The swept-wing design common on every modern jet you see today is one of the many processes extracted from the wreckage of the Reich. But this transfer also included aviation medicine, a field built on the data from fatal experiments conducted in concentration camps. To study the effects of extreme pressure and cold, Nazi doctors put prisoners in high-altitude chambers and watched them die. The resulting data was organized, cataloged, and brought to America by the very men who oversaw the research. In one courtroom, the U.S. was prosecuting Nazi doctors for these heinous crimes. Through the back door of another building, the U.S. military was quietly hosting the men who had facilitated them. By integrating this blood-stained data into its own military research, the United States accepted the benefits of the science while choosing to look past the circumstances of its creation. Arthur Rudolph was a NASA executive and a close collaborator of von Braun. His work on the Saturn V was so critical to the moonshot that NASA awarded him its Distinguished Service Medal. Before coming to NASA, Rudolph was the operations director at the Middlework factory. He didn't just know about the slave labor, he oversaw it, watching men die in the tunnels while they built his rockets. For 40 years, he lived freely in the United States as a celebrated engineer, shaking hands with presidents while his past was kept hidden. It wasn't until 1984 that Rudolph surrendered his American citizenship and left the country permanently to avoid prosecution for war crimes. He was never tried. He simply walked away. His decades of unearned honor prove how effectively institutional silence can protect a useful asset. To this day, no U.S. agency has publicly addressed the vetting process used during Operation Paperclip, or the deliberate editing of the scientists' records. Wernher von Braun died an American citizen and a television star. He was never formally investigated for the thousands who died in his tunnels. The entire moral justification for the program was reduced to 4 words: we needed them. It is a utilitarian logic, the idea that the strategic ends justify the moral means. It is the same rationale used to justify compromises in science, politics, and war. The 20,000 prisoners who died in the dark at Middlework have no monuments in the country that benefited from their labor, but von Braun does. If you look at the surface of the moon, you will find a crater permanently named after the man who built the rocket that got us there. A society that celebrates the rocket while refusing to look at the tunnel is destined to repeat the bargain. We went to the moon, and we should never stop asking how.